practice and action research. So the first question for this week's vlog was, who am I as a reflective practitioner? Where do I want to see it in my practice? Where do I already see it in my practice? And my goals for the course, and to do so using a KWL format. So I think, to me, reflective practice is really knowing how to improve on your teaching practice and how to improve on yourself as a teacher. So I think without reflection, it's really hard to know where we want our practice to go, where we want our teachings to go, and who we really want to be as teachers. And it's really hard to get to that goal without reflecting, because without reflective practice, we can't come up with the strategies that are necessary to get us where we want to be and to keep us always learning and improving and adapting. And I think those are huge, huge parts to being a teacher, and reflective practice is really what helps us to get there. As a reflective practitioner myself, I think that I am very aware. I think that I always try my best to reflect after I teach on what went well and what needs room for improvement. I think that reflecting on what went well and what didn't go so well are equally as important. It's good to reflect on our successes, because in that way we know what we're doing well and where our strengths are, but then it's also important to reflect on where we need to improve, because that shows us where we have room to grow and where we have room to continue to perfect our practice. So I think reflecting on both is equally as important, because they define us as a teacher equally as strongly. So I think knowing all aspects of who we are as a teacher is very important. So yes, I think that I'm very aware as a reflective practitioner, and I always try and look at my teaching as detailed as possible. So I think that I'm pretty detail-oriented when it comes to reflecting. I can pick apart the different sections of my teaching, so the beginning, the middle, and end, see what went well, what didn't go well, and I usually base my reflections off of my students' reactions or their level of engagement. So if my students are participating really well, having really good discussions with one another, then I probably have an idea that the lesson went well, whereas if the opposite is true, then I know that I need to improve on some part of my teaching. So I really base my reflections based off of my students and their responses, and less so upon myself, which is where I want to improve. I think that I need to pay attention more to what I do and to how I feel about my teaching, and think about it less so in terms of my students. I mean, students are very, very obviously important to our teaching, and we always want to make sure that we are engaging them as much as possible. But to really become a good reflective practitioner, I think I need to focus more on who I am and on my teaching, and less on my students and what they've done, because then I'll be able to really analyze myself and know where I want to go in the future with my teaching, whereas our students change all the time. So our teaching can really, really depend on who's in our class and who our students are. So I need to analyze more of myself and see how I can adapt to that and see how I can teach to different students, instead of reflecting on my students' reactions, because that group is going to change every semester. So my goal for this course is to become more intentional in my reflection. As I said, I really base my reflections off of my students' reactions, and I think that I struggle with planning and reflecting before I practice to make things as good for my students or as engaging for my students as they can possibly be. So I really want to focus more on pre-teaching reflective practice instead of just post-teaching, because I think that it's important to reflect on how we think our lesson is going to go and where we need to pay more attention or what we need to solidify our knowledge about. And that is something that I think I struggle with, is that I'm always really eager to get going and I don't take the time to reflect on what it is that I need to go into a lesson to be the best teacher that I can. So in that sense, I think I can improve on being much more intentional with my reflections and using the feedback that I kind of gather from reflecting to further improve my future lessons. Oftentimes I think I know how to reflect, but I don't know how to apply what I've learned from reflecting, so becoming more intentional and focusing my practical application of my reflections is really where I want to improve. So to sum up, Some things that I know is that I'm very aware and I'm very detail-oriented when it comes to teaching and my students and my reflection in the classroom. I know that I can teach a lesson and then be able to pick apart the different parts of that lesson to see what went well and what didn't go well. What I want to know is how to become more intentional and how to come up with different strategies and how to actually apply my reflective practice into my actual teaching. So not just reflecting, but being able to put that reflection into action. And some things that I've learned so far in this course is that looking at our successes and looking at our weaknesses are equally as important to reflection. So that's something that I didn't know going into this class. I always kind of looked at what I didn't do well and where I needed to improve as opposed to my successes, but I think that looking at both sides of the coin are really going to help me develop as a teacher, because then I'll know what I am doing well, what I'm not doing well, how can I use my strengths to improve my weaknesses, and how can I overall become a better reflective practitioner, and how will that help me contribute to being a better teacher. So I think that reflection is extremely, extremely important for being a good teacher, and I'm very excited to get started in this class so that I can come away with all the strategies that I need to be the best teacher that I can. Alright, thank you. Hi, this is Bailey again, and I'm doing my second vlog for this semester for reflective practice and action research. So for this vlog, I chose to focus on the prompt see, think, and wonder. So for this approach, I wanted to choose a specific example from my past placement and kind of reflect on that and see how my views on reflection would help me to change the situation. Could I go back in time and do it all over again? So in my last placement, I worked in a grade 12 college preparation English class, which was extremely rewarding, but one of the most challenging experiences I think that I've had. So in this class, we were learning about child soldiers and human rights around the world. And for this, we had to read a book called A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bia. And we chose to listen to the audiobook as a class throughout these 6 weeks. So one thing that I saw in doing this unit is that my students were extremely not engaged. A lot of them did not feel confident in their reading and writing skills, which I think turned them off of the novel right off the bat, which was very challenging for me because from day one they were kind of closed-minded about doing this novel, and I had to find ways to engage them and get them involved. So some things that I saw were students not really willing to put in the effort that was needed to understand this novel, and students not making an effort to be engaged. So one of my strategies was to try different activities every day that tailored to different intelligences, just to see how students responded and reacted, but I didn't really elicit too many positive responses all the time because students didn't want to be doing the novel. So that was one thing that I saw, was kind of a lack of engagement throughout the 6 weeks. So finally, looking at this makes me think about my students and their previous experiences with English. I think by the time that they had gotten into grade 12, they had very preconceived notions about the subject and about their success levels. So I think that they really either felt like they couldn't do it or they didn't want to do it because they had had bad experiences in English classes before, or didn't feel as if they were competent in the subject and therefore did not want to even try because they didn't want to fail. That was kind of the resounding reaction that I got all through those 6 weeks. It's that students just didn't want to even try because they were afraid of failing. So that was one thing that I really saw and made me think during my placement. So that was what I was thinking about, was how do I defeat preconceived notions about a subject in only 6 weeks, and how do I get students engaged and kind of make them feel confident in their abilities. And this really made me wonder about how to keep reluctant students engaged. So I found it very difficult because previously, in my previous placement, in my second one, I worked in a gifted class and students were very willing to learn and try new things and participate and do all the work that was assigned, and that was pretty seamless in that respect. Whereas in this class, students didn't want to be engaged, and they just kind of wanted to get the credit and get in and get out. So it makes me wonder how to engage students who are reluctant to learn or to participate, and make them really appreciate what you are doing in class. So in looking back on this, I definitely would kind of change my approach, because I would take more note of how my students were reacting to my teaching, but also what I was doing as a teacher. So as I said in my first vlog, I really based my teaching off of my students' responses and kind of reactions to what we were doing, which I think is okay to an extent, but I think that I really needed to more deeply analyze who I was as a teacher and the messages I was conveying to them, and how I was making them feel about the subject and about themselves. And I think that had I been maybe more encouraging or more supportive, they would have been more willing to take risks and try the activities and participate in class. So in reflecting on that experience, I think that I definitely could have been paying more attention to my own teaching and worrying less about my students, or not worrying less about my students, but basing all of my teaching off of my students, I think made things very difficult for me, because I was constantly self-conscious that they weren't wanting to engage or participate. But to improve the situation, I think I definitely could have looked at my own teaching and seen what I was doing, instead of just how my students were reacting in class, because I think it definitely requires a balance of both, to be a good teacher, obviously to pay attention to your students, but to pay attention to yourself as well. And I was definitely doing more of paying attention to my students. So this is really helping me to become more intentional, and could I go back in time and do it again, I definitely would be looking at my students, talking to them one-on-one, helping me to reflect on what I was doing in the classroom, and how this would help me to become a better reflective practitioner and therefore a better teacher. So in my first vlog, I said that my goal was to become more intentional, and I think now, after learning a lot about reflective practice and how to execute that as a teacher, I have a lot of the strategies now that I think would help me become more intentional in my teaching. Definitely my pre-planning reflection was lacking in my second placement, so I would do much more of that. But I think that just goes to show that I'm now reflecting on my experiences, and I'm learning a lot from what I've previously done, which will help me going forward, because I'll be able to evaluate myself better and reflect better and become a better teacher. So yeah, I think that I'm really working well to becoming more intentional in my teaching. And to do more pre-planning reflection based on my past experiences. Those are really helping me to learn what I want to continue in the future in my teaching and what I'd like to improve upon. So yeah, this semester is still going well, and I'm excited to keep going. Hi, it's Bailey here, and I'm just getting ready to do my last vlog for the semester for reflective practice and action research. This course has been very eye-opening to me. I've learned a lot about myself, about who I want to be as a teacher, about how to improve on my teaching, so I'm really grateful for that, and I think that I will take a lot of what I learned in this course going forward, and I can't wait to actually apply it to my teaching. So one thing I just wanted to touch on going into this last vlog was that for the self-assessment and Teach, Reflect, and Learn, I was in the conscious stage at the very beginning, and my score actually did not change from that self-assessment the second time that I took it at the very end. I think a lot of this is because I haven't actually had the chance to apply what I've learned this semester into my actual teaching, so it's hard for me to visualize how I'm going to behave differently or how I'm going to reflect differently and act around my students. So I thought this was something pretty interesting, that even though I know that I've learned a lot and learned a lot about reflective practice and using that in teaching, I haven't actually had the chance to use it yet. So I'm pretty excited to see how my teaching will change in the fall when I go back into schools and use what I've learned. So that was just one thing I wanted to touch upon. So in my KWL from the first vlog a few weeks ago, I said that I knew that I was in the that I was aware. I said that I knew that I was aware as a reflectioner. I'm very aware of what's going on in the classroom, how students are reacting, engaging, responding, and how I'm think that I'm pretty in tune with that. So that is one thing that I know. What I wanted to know is the strategies to become more intentional in my practice, and how to really reflect not just at the end of my teaching, but at the beginning and during my actual teaching, so that I'm getting all different aspects of my teaching, and I can improve on all different methods of my teaching practice. So that was one thing that I really wanted to know, is some strategies for me going forward, is how do I reflect before I teach, how do I reflect during my actual teaching when there's so much going on, and how do I improve on my post-teaching practice, reflective practice. So those are things I wanted to know, and some things that I had learned already in the first couple weeks was that I did not know going in that reflection was centered around both your areas for improvement and your strengths, and that was one thing that I learned in the first couple weeks, is it's equally as important to reflect on what we do well, as well as what we don't do well, because things that we do well we can continue, things that we need to improve upon we can find ways to grow and adapt to do that. So that was one thing that I learned, and I'm really happy I learned it, because that was very eye-opening for me. Reflection to me beforehand had always meant looking at what you did poorly and improving upon it, and I think that that's one thing that has changed for me, and one realization that I've had is that being really hard on yourself and beating yourself up after you feel like a lesson didn't go well isn't good reflection, because you're just making yourself maybe feel bad or feel worse about how your teaching went, when that's not being a good reflective practitioner, because we're not paying attention to what did go well, and we're not really trying, or at least for myself, I wasn't really trying to find ways to improve upon what I did poorly. I was just reflecting on the fact that it had not gone well. So that's one big realization that I've had, is that reflection isn't being hard on ourselves, but it's looking at both sides. What did I do well? What didn't I do well? How can I use what I did do well to improve what I didn't do well? And how can I continue to do that and make that work, while also adapting and growing as a teacher to find new strategies to replace the ones that might not have gone as well as I hoped. So that was definitely a big realization that I had, and that I think is really going to help me going forward, because I'll know to recognize what I did well is just as important to recognize what I didn't do well, because we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, and we need to use those to our advantage and really delve deep into who we are as educators through reflection. One strategy that I have used, like I said before, I haven't actually had the chance to teach since this course started, so I haven't been able to use too many of the strategies, unfortunately. But some strategies that I will use is to take the time before I teach to really reflect on how I want my day to go. So I think I had said it in maybe my first or my second vlog, but that I usually am so eager to start teaching because I get nervous or I get anxious about how it's going to go, that I don't take the time to think about how I want my day to go, or what will I do if X, Y, and Z happens. I just kind of jump in head first. However, I think that reflecting before we teach is extremely valuable, because not only does it give us some separation from the day before and we can reflect on things in a new light, but we're able to reflect on what we want to come out of our day, what we want our students to take away with from our class, and how we can constantly work toward being the best teacher that we can be. And I think that taking that time before we teach gives us a moment to breathe and to really envision who we want to be as teachers and how we can put that into effect. So I'm definitely going to try and do that in my next placement or any other opportunity I have to teach before then, to take the time before I teach and really reflect on who I am as a teacher, who I want to be as a teacher, and how I can allow myself to get there through every lesson. So that's something that's really important to me, because in the past I had always just reflected at the end and kind of called it a day, but now I know that I need to reflect before I teach as well as during, so that I can adapt and gauge my students' responses and levels of engagement. And if I'm not reflecting during my teaching, then I can't really adapt to suit my students' needs, and that's something that's really important to me as a teacher. So I definitely think that I've met my goal in this sense of being more intentional, because I think that that pre-teaching reflective stage allows us to really plan with our students in mind. And if we're reflecting while we are planning for the day or before we're actually about to teach it, we're always keeping the students at the forefront of our mind, And that was something that I really wanted to improve on, and I think that through the strategies that I have gained through this course, that's something that I'll be able to do much better. I always want my students to be at the forefront of my mind in my classroom, but I find with reflection it's very, it can be easy to kind of focus on ourselves, even though I think I mentioned before that I focus on my students a lot, but I really need to focus on what they need from me to succeed. And that is something that I really want to do, and I think that I've been given the strategies to do so, and plan with more intention and reflect with more intention. So I'm really happy about that. I think my next goal would be just to continue to adapt. So by that I mean reflecting during my practice. I think it's really easy to get caught up in the craziness of teaching a lesson and of being in a million places at once in the classroom, but I really want to be able to kind of have the gears turning in the back of my mind as to how the lesson is going. What can I do to improve it? What do my students need from me to take something away from this class that maybe they hadn't learned before, hadn't realized before. So my next goal is to reflect during my practice and not just before and after, and I think that I feel very equipped to do so. So I just want to thank you for a wonderful semester. I've learned a lot, and I'm really excited to put what I've learned into action, and yeah, so thank you very much, and I can't wait to become a better reflective practitioner and then become a better teacher.